Greetings, you magnificent, you miserable accursed. It's David Herle with the ever-fabulous Jordan Leichnitz, the always fabulous, despite the melancholy yellow hue of his home office, Scott Reid, and the follically as well as sartorially fabulous Kory Teneycke. So just a little bit of political news over the weekend, huh, team?
Yeah,
where were you when you found out, Kory?
I'm embarrassed to say. I was in the Spawn of Four Seasons.
Of course. It was Sunday.
Oh, check that.
So I was getting the avocado scrub like usual. You mix it up. Sometimes it's the mango crotch effect. But,
it's, hashtag truth. But anyway, it's terrible but true.
Oh, Jordan, you missed it entirely.
Yeah, I was camping in Algonquin with no cell service. It was very peaceful. And then we drove out back into the real world kind of around 4:00 and my phone imploded. So, but that's a good reason for your phone to implode. We were very happy to see the news.
Oh, I know. It just lit up. Like the emails, your WhatsApp chat groups, everything was just blowing off. Yeah. So, Scott, what were your wise words yesterday as you were opining to Canadians about this on the radio?
Well, when I first heard it, the first thing out of my mouth was, "Fuck, Sam, I'm cutting the lawn." My 11-year-old rushed out into the yard and tapped me on the shoulder. And, the lawnmower's loud and I'm not paying attention. He scared the hell out of me. And he's like, "No, Dad, you gotta come in. The president's dead." I'm like, "What?" I'm thinking, what else can happen now, right? Like, no, something, I don't know. You got to come inside. And yeah, so then there's a TV special and radio special and all kinds of stuff, but like, whatever. I mean, at that point, you know what my first reaction was, and it's been dashed already, was I hope they have an open primary. I hope they pressure test these candidates, let 4 or 5 people get into this race, create some excitement, dynamism, get media coverage for a month, and find if Kamala Harris is so goddamn good, great. Let her prove it. Let her prove it by wiping the boards with Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer. But it looks like this is a full-on stampede toward her candidacy. It almost makes you feel like Biden sat around and at least had the coherence to say, "Look, if you fuckers are pushing me out, we are going to get the dignity of handing this over to Kamala." So.
All right. Well, that's going to be our first topic.
Nancy Pelosi sat around and had that conversation.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to be our first topic: is what happened in the States and how does it impact back in Canada? What is it making Trudeau think about right now? Then we'll see if we can squeeze a little juice out of the Council of the Federation Premiers meeting last week. Took place in Halifax. It feels like a matter of professional obligation that we discuss this matter, so we will. And then our cursed clipping is from Philip Ling and Peter Zimonjic at CBC News. Canada and China had a coffee date. Minister Jolie met with her foreign minister counterpart in Beijing, the first such face-to-face talk since 2017. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, Mr. Pinsent wraps it up with our Hey Yous. So, a besieged leader took stock of his circumstances, did a true assessment of his re-election chances, resigned, and in the process secured his place in history as a consequential president. In other news, Justin Trudeau accepted Seamus O'Regan's resignation, appointed Steve McKinnon, and then went on vacation. Scott, is Biden's decision having any impact on Trudeau's thinking right now?
I don't think so. I don't think that Trudeau looks across the border and says, "Oh my, I'm watching this exit," and it feels to me like that's the path to trod. I don't think so at all. But I had a number of people send me notes, ask me, like liberals, others, going, do you think this shows the way? I'll put this particular asterisk on it. I got a number of people who said, well, maybe the lesson of this is that caucus will see and senior liberals will see that if you apply direct pressure on the leader, you can dislodge them, you can demonstrate to them that, because people say, well, there was no mechanism to remove Biden, so he couldn't go. And people say, well, there's no mechanism to remove Trudeau, so he can't go. And some people were saying to me yesterday, well, see, now this shows that if you get a steady torrent of senior public voices saying it's time to go, that can lead them out. And I'll just say this right now, ain't going to happen. Like, I really strongly do not believe you're going to see 30, 40, 50 caucus members rise over the trench and rush toward Trudeau with a demand to resign. I don't think you're going to see a repetition.
Well, Democrats didn't do it either until confronted with something so severe that it couldn't be avoided. I mean, Democrats have been, not doing this for a year. Somebody could have challenged Biden.
Yeah, it wasn't bad polls. It was a precipitating event. It was an undeniable eye test crisis. And, I still think that Trudeau will eventually decide on his own, but I don't think the lesson of this past weekend is, oh, you know what? We can fell him. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's how liberals in this caucus think, and I don't think that's going to occur.
Kory, what do you think?
I think that there is more of a look across the border element, and whether or not Trudeau himself is going through that process of looking across at this or not, I guess is something only he knows. But I think, as all of us could attest to in the messages and things that we've received and the comments that we've heard, everyone else is looking at it that way. Right. So I don't know. I think it's more likely that Trudeau is than isn't. But certainly others who have some share of voice in what's going to happen here are viewing it through that lens. And I think that the Democrats are in the process of making yet another mistake. And I think Scott put his finger on what it is. I think the fundamental contradiction in their narrative before Biden's resignation was the presidency is at stake, democracy is at stake, the entire future of the nation, and whether or not it continues to be a republic is at stake. And therefore, we must have an infirm, dementia-ridden candidate as the only option for us. Now that contradictory narrative is being replaced by a contradictory narrative that democracy is at stake, all the same stuff. And therefore, we must coronate someone whose poll numbers are almost as bad as Biden's, which does not stand to reason when you look at some of the other options that are out there for them. And even if you were to go through some expedited process and it results in Harris winning, Harris comes out of that stronger, not weaker. She comes out vetted and strengthened and with a campaign team of her own. What she has right now is a coronation which is going to satisfy very few people, with the same questionable team of campaign folks around her that thought Biden was a good idea and that thought hiding Biden's illness was a good idea and thought, so I just see this as perhaps better than having Biden on the ballot, but making a lot of the same mistakes and calls into question, I think, the judgment of the people around Biden yet again.
Jordan, 3 minutes after, maybe not even 3 minutes after Biden made his decision, the world was full of Democrats and journalists doing the reevaluation of Biden. After weeks of kicking him around, they were all, holy God, this guy, what a consequential president, what a great number of things he did. And he saved the country by beating Trump last time. And now he's saving the country by stepping aside so Trump can be beaten this time. And it was the full canonization of Joe Biden. Do you think Trudeau could expect anything like that if he were to make the same decision?
No, because unlike Joe Biden, Trudeau is personally hated by such a large slice of the population at this point. I think it really prevents that sort of a pivot. And the difference with Biden is that, I think for the vast majority, certainly for the vast majority of non-MAGA people in the U.S., he wasn't hated. He was liked. And the advice to depart was given despite people liking and respecting his work and maybe even viewing him as a successful and I think we can all agree quite consequential president. But there's really not that same unanimity about Trudeau's record here. There's not that same sense that of the weight of history.
I would do it. I would do it. I would say, if he stepped down, I would say, look, this guy moved forward the yardsticks on Indigenous affairs massively, changed the dialogue, changed the relationship put vast amounts of money in. That's different. He had a substantial climate policy. Some of it may get rolled back, some of it won't. But Canada's in better shape on the on climate because, I mean, you could go down and you could say...
You could, but David, I really think that like the people who are capable of recasting Trudeau's record in those terms are it's ultimately also the arc of the Liberal Party, right? Like it's the story of his, him stepping in, saving the party from the brink, remaking it in his own image, doing some good stuff along the way. And then knowing whether or not to depart based on that. And I just think the cases are very different. And, it's interesting, the question also of whether caucus will now see this as, oh, well, if we organize, we can potentially pressure him out. I don't think that it's comparable in that sense, because you had in the US, you had somebody like Nancy Pelosi working behind the scenes discreetly, not through necessarily her own ambition, but really lining things up. Like you wouldn't have had, for example, I think yesterday, the number of voices coming out to quickly endorse Harris, whatever we think of that decision. And I would also raise questions about whether it's a good idea to go through a non-competitive process to coronate her. But like there was a hand at work there, right? That's not what's happening within the Liberal Party. And even within caucus, I think there's every evidence that group of folks within the Liberal caucus right now are not really capable of organizing anything like that. They weren't capable of organizing enough pressure to get a caucus meeting, let alone anything else. So I don't think it's comparable there. But I would say like one place, or actually I think two places where it's comparable. So the first is he stepped aside. They're going with a new nominee, even though so many people said it was logistically impossible. And this touches on a bit what you guys raised earlier. So I do think that if I were Trudeau, that would make me nervous, because we're clearly in the realm of anything is possible, and people who whine and complain about internal logistics of a leadership race, like it's not a thing. Like this season of the fall of the Republic in the US is insane, and anything can happen, right? So anything ergo is also possible here within the scope of political pressure. And then the second thing I think that's really interesting is actually what's happening with the Trump campaign. And I think that a bit like Poilievre and the Conservative campaign, the whole thing is predicated on a specific opponent. Like that is the cement basement from which the whole edifice is built, was Biden as a weak leader. Sure. And now that Biden is gone, it's going to be, they have to rebuild the airplane as
well, Trump only looks young compared to Biden.
That's right.
He looks old compared to younger people.
And I think, it's interesting to think, like, what was the response yesterday? It was pretty scattershot on their part. Like, they didn't have a clean hit. He was out maybe wanting to postpone the next debate. And, like, they seem to be caught a bit flat-footed. So I thought it's going to be really interesting to watch them retool on the fly over the next week and see what they do. And that did, to me, bring to mind potentially some similarities here.
Right. So this week, I want to put a more human lens on our summer of fascinating and very useful tech. Technology is core to the story, sure, but it's really about care and easing some of the issues surrounding homelessness. In Montreal, this is a problem on the rise. The most recent count estimated that almost 4,700 people in the city experience visible homelessness. As you can imagine, access to care and services is almost impossible. Almost. TELUS Health for Good has partnered with Montreal's Old Brewery Mission, providing one of their mobile health clinics to help break down barriers to accessing care. These incredible Mercedes Sprinter vans are custom outfitted into a 2-room health clinic on wheels, equipped with state-of-the-art health technology. Fully functional doctor's offices on wheels. The mobile clinics meet and treat marginalized and homeless people where they are, which is to say, anywhere. Since launching a little over a year ago, the Old Brewery Clinic in Montreal has provided nearly 4,500 patient visits. Services include cohabitation and reaffiliation support, including referral to local emergency services, legal services, and administrative help, rehousing-related support, assistance with tax returns, identity documents, and housing applications, healthcare services, preventative testing, wound care, harm reduction services, as well as mental health and addiction referrals. And think of how important this is. Each van is equipped with TELUS Health electronic medical records. This allows clinic staff to create a patient record, collect and store data, examine results over time, and provide better continuity of care to patients whose medical histories were previously undocumented. The TELUS Health for Good program has provided care on mobile health clinics across 25 Canadian communities since launching over 10 years ago, Hurley-Burleyites. That's over 230,000 patients cared for and growing. More next week. So the Trudeau people had in their first term in office Dan Arnold from Polara, who had done the campaign polling in the PMO as a public opinion advisor. He left after the first term, and they replaced him with a much more junior person who doesn't have the same status within the PMO, doesn't have the same history of doing research. And I've been told they do very little, if any, polling. And
Good idea.
So I'm watching the Biden thing, and I read in Politico that when Mike Donlan and the other guy went to his house on the weekend, Donlan presented to him the first swing state polling that they had done in months. Okay? And he looked at it and he said, well, that's bad. Right? I think it's possible that Trudeau doesn't know how bad it is. I know that I hear them bad-mouthing Coletto already as an opponent, right? Somebody that's put on a partisan sweater. So there's a pushback against the polling data internally. I wonder if they really understand how bad it is.
I think they do, but I think they're bullshitting themselves. So I hear arguments that I don't think are simply fashioned for external purposes. So I hear arguments like there's been real movement underlying with certain demographics, youth. There's actually, it's closer than people know. So then you need to chip away about 6-7 more. There we are. We only ever need to get to 33-34%. We've proven with the efficiency of our vote, we can win a majority on that. So, over the arc of the next number of months, but those arguments were also what I was hearing in the spring. They've proven to be untrue until now. You have to actually disbelieve other objective evidence in order to buy that. So I think those are arguments that are fashioned to try to persuade people to get through conversations and beers in Ottawa. But I think they believe it to a degree. I think they are compelled by it for the reasons that we all are when we're, in tight, which is that if you don't convince yourself of it, then you just lay in bed with a bottle of rye whiskey and sing the party's over. So I think all of that, but I do think objectively that they know. Now, how much is the prime minister shielded from it? How much does the prime minister personally believe, because of the kind of creature he is, which is formidable politically, that he could still find room to rally this thing? Who's to say? I do think the working thesis that Poilievre is going to disqualify himself is being disproved day after day, month after month. And I think that's got
quite the reverse is happening. He's being normalized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
Totally agree.
I remain of the view that the prime minister will get to Christmas and then he'll take genuine stock of this stuff. But maybe I'm a fool.
Well, Kory, in the dying days of a regime, what is the bunker like?
He has to ask because David and I have no idea.
Yeah.
We've only ridden the victory train. Sorry.
I can't tell my stories without weeping. So Kory's made of sterner stuff than I am.
I think that you have more enabling going on and access to independent views and objective information becomes scarcer and scarcer, in part because the person in charge doesn't want to hear it and doesn't want to see it and reacts poorly to it. And therefore, as the old saying goes, that, your ability to accept bad news, bends the arc of all the news that you receive going forward and the kinds of advice you receive going forward. So I just think you hear less and less what you don't want to hear and more what you do. So, you tell the boss that David Coletto is actually a conservative stooge, even though there's absolutely no evidence to support that. And that his numbers are more or less margin of error, same as everybody else's who's out polling. But you start polling less because, what are you hoping to gain? You're just going to get more news that the boss doesn't want to hear. So I think, bunker mentality is exactly that. It's, you are isolated in a secure location with a very small number of people around you and getting less and less reliable information from the outside world. So I think that's what's going on. I will quibble with some of what Scott started with around, removal of leaders. Like, this is something we've talked about before. There's never a process. It always ends up being some version of the same. And in this case, like in all cases, it's the person in charge deciding to leave, making a determination that it's not in the cards and it's not in their interest or the interest of the party to continue on. I think that.
How does that reconcile with what we just witnessed with Biden? It wasn't like he was away for 4 days with COVID and said, I really had a time to reflect on it, checked out my inner soul and came to this conclusion. It was a combination of polling and public voices calling for him to go and private calls.
Yeah. But that's happening with Trudeau as well. But it wasn't some giant revolt where like a third of the congressional caucus was going to up and leave or something like it. There was very little of that. And I think we can point to other examples where there was very little of that, where Patrick Brown left, where Andrew Scheer left, where, you can go through a whole range of resignations where I would say, it was a lot less big than the context I think you guys framed this from, which is the Martin Chrétien one, which is an outlier in the size of the constituency for a replacement and the level of organization around a successor. I think, while that is a relevant example, it's more the outlier than it is the norm.
Totally. I just, to wrap up this conversation, I wore my Neil Young t-shirt today because whether it's Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau, Russ never sleeps.
There you go.
I'm sorry. Can I add one thing, though? I know that was a lovely denouement, but can I just add this, David? In all honesty, I hear about bunker mentality. We laugh and we talk about it. We can all cite lots of examples. But I don't know that that's exactly my personal experience. I mean, I know that I would get defensive as shit. I know that I would keep trying to find some way to stick a jab in and bruise somebody's eye. But I kind of think, I think about the campaigns you and I were on where we're losing. We suffered from hyper realism and hyper objectivity. I think that our number one concern was how we would project something other than morose displeasure about the situation. And we were worried about the eyes on us within a campaign and how people would say, well, we must be well and truly fucked. Look at Reid. Like, I can remember us going downstairs. The nearest place to get a drink in 2018 was, the Red Lobster. The place smelled like the crack of a fisherman's ass. And you and I would be down there going, well, why aren't they serving alcohol? And then someone would have to come over, usually a cleaner, and say, well, it's only 10, sir. Right? So, yeah. So you should leave.
I mean,
Were
I think
you still there or just arrived?
Arrived, yeah. So I would just say that it doesn't. There are reasons to try to soldier through that don't necessarily equate to lying to yourself.
Right.
I think there's always a balance, right? Like, you have to have, and I think I probably sat on more losing campaigns than the three of you combined. So. This is an area in which I do have
different when you expect it, Jordan.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's important to define the parameters of law.
What is that chair back in Langevin?
But look, I think that there's there is a need, and I think what Scott's talking about in terms of projecting internally within the campaign, possible paths to victory, vigorously pursuing those, keeping the energy upbeat within the team and to the principal. Like that all has a really important role. But there is also a moment where things do cross a bit into magical thinking. And there's a moment where the audience becomes less about projecting that in order to project it externally, in order, for voters to maybe be attracted to the good juju, and where it becomes about internal management and where it becomes about constructing a world around a leader or around a senior team that conforms to what they need to continue to function, right? And I think that there's sometimes a moment where that switchover happens. And my feeling is that with Trudeau, I wonder now the degree to which that has become an internal discussion. And that's actually what's deadly there. Like the hope and the positive energy and like that stuff is all important and good and has a place even in campaigns when you're really down. But if your audience has become about internal management, and if the conduits for external voices have become fewer and fewer, like those are all really big red flags to where that's become something that's toxic and that's hampering your ability to make clear-eyed judgments about what's happening.
But I think in addition to the sort of bunker mentality, one of the tells is things that should be seen as bad news and flags of concern are greeted with cheers or inappropriately. So let's talk about Seamus leaving. Like that should be a big warning. Like if guys in that demographic with that level of calm strength and a political runway still ahead of them,
and in the PM's wedding party,
it's like, oh well, he'd been sidelined for a while, and it's like fuck that guy, he can go, they're not. I didn't see any reaction to that I felt was appropriate for the message that it was sending. Like that is a reason to be very concerned, because that's not somebody who's coming out and saying Trudeau's got to go, but that's basically what they're saying by departing the scene in the way that they did.
Yeah.
It's a big loss, right? Like,
well, it's like it made me think of Baird leaving right before the election.
That's right.
And it's like, well, if Baird's going, shit, that's not good.
Right.
They don't see him that way. Let's just be honest about it. I think Seamus is great. He's a personal friend. We worked together as political staffers 25 years ago. We worked together in broadcasting at CTV. I've talked to him.
They don't see him that way. That's my point.
They don't see him that way. They don't. But that wasn't just like they don't just see him that way now and kind of go, oh well, we're not going to give him a big fanfare or whatever. Like they moved him out of natural resources. Right. It was only his raw political skill and communication skill that kept that guy in a place where people might notice him if you're following politics. And so I don't think they go, oh my goodness, internally and say, well, this is a bit of an earthquake and we got to be careful about what signal this sends to a broader environment. They'd already shuffled him to the back row. And
he was one of their best performers.
I don't think they can afford to lose any more good communicators, really.
Like, he wasn't just a good communicator. He was one of their best ministers in whatever job they put him in. He was not just a communicator, he was a good minister.
Yep.
Well,
the labor movement's reaction to his departure was Biden-esque, if you will. It was, oh my God, this guy was the best labor minister we've ever had.
And also a touch of, well, I guess the Liberals have just fucking given up on this file then. Right? Yeah. Like there's a touch of, well, if they're going to let this guy walk away, then he's the last ambassador of our movement that we're willing to bother to sit down and have a donut with.
Well, because he brought the bacon, right? Like,
other than Fraser, who are the other bright spots of the last 6-8 months in terms of actually having managed a crisis and dealt with issues?
Dom, obviously, but there aren't a whole lot.
Fraser, maybe, and him, but like he's dealt with a couple of pretty sticky strikes and managed to get that through. So, like, I don't know, like objectively, he's one of the bright spots, and he's now gone.
Yeah, and his proximity to the Prime Minister makes it loaded with symbolism as well. In the spirit of vapid summer contentment, dear hurly-burlyites, today I bring you some fairly useless but pretty interesting bits and pieces of information that you can use to fascinate everyone over hamburgers and beer. Do you know what a hopper is? Counterintuitively, it doesn't hop. A hopper is a container, with a hole in the bottom, usually with sloped sides to take advantage of gravity, as in a hopper full of coffee beans. The word has been in use for at least 800 years. Chaucer used it in the Reeve's Tale to describe a contraption that ground wheat into flour. These days, though, hopper usually means a railway car. Our sponsor, CN, uses thousands of them to move millions of tons of grain out of Western Canada to markets. The hopper car fleet is modern, high capacity, and efficient. CN's railroaders can load and unload them fast. The newest versions can move about 20% more grain than the ones you might have seen at level crossings as a kid. This summer is hot, but grain is moving smoothly from the prairies to ports on the Pacific and the Great Lakes. It's one of CN's main jobs, and it's getting done. But I digress. I promised you useless summer information. CN is no longer in the passenger business, but when it was, it ferried pro hockey teams from game to game, including the Maple Leafs and the New York Rangers. How's that? And Marilyn Monroe commuted via CN to location while she was shooting River of No Return in Jasper. Do you think hops had anything to do with the word hopper? Just asking. All right, let's go to our clipping of the day. It's from CBC News. Canada and China pledged to advance relations in a pragmatic manner on Friday, as the two countries moved to stabilize bilateral ties following more than 6 years of frosty relations over the imprisonment of two Canadian citizens. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met in Beijing, the first face-to-face talks in Canada's capital involving a Canadian foreign minister since 2017. The statement released by China following Friday's meeting was remarkable because it was devoid of the strongly worded attacks and overt animosity toward Canada that have been typical of official statements by Beijing over the past 6 years. Instead, Friday's 800-word readout was more measured and diplomatic. Canada-China relations have long been at the forefront of China's relations with Western countries, the statement read. There is no fundamental conflict of interest between China and Canada. Diplomacy doesn't mean you only meet with people you agree with, said Guy Saint-Jacques in an interview with CBC's Power and Politics. Taking into account the importance of China, I think it was important for Minister Joly to meet, to raise those difficult issues, and to talk about Canadian expectations. So, Jordan, there's two things that occur to me when I'm reading this. One of which is, what are the politics of this? China is a hot topic in Canada. With between foreign interference in elections and various things, issues that she raised. Is it good politics to be seen to be cozying up with China or rebuilding relationships with China right now? And the second thing is Joly, in the context of what we've just been talking about. She appears to be ambitious, not just politically, but as a minister. Like, this is a big, bold move, and she likes some big, bold moves. And I think that she is strutting her stuff as foreign minister in a way that she never did in any of the other jobs that she has. And I think that she's emerging as a viable political person.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at her trajectory. And certainly she was handed just some real shitty files at Heritage that didn't allow her to take any sort of shiny position, right? And so I think that in some ways, foreign affairs could have been more of the same, particularly in our current context. It's a lot of bad news. So to me, that makes this make more sense. She needs to put a bit of a stamp on her leadership at foreign affairs, and re-engaging with China with some guardrails around that, I think makes a lot of sense. And I mean, look, it was said in the story, it's been said everywhere, but diplomatic engagement's not a reward, right? It's a tool. And so to me, it makes perfect sense to have our foreign minister engaging in China like this. That's actually what you would want to see. I think that her ability to have that conversation, and it was very carefully done, that she also went over and raised the issue of foreign interference in those talks. And that was very clearly noted. That's also about protecting their flank on that. I think that it's tough to argue against this. There's no getting around the enormity of China's influence in Canada, but not just political, but of course on trade, technology. It is far better for us to be speaking than to go into the deep freeze of relations that we had over the last 6 years. That the what happened with the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou, like it absolutely hampered our ability to solve other problems with China. So I don't see a lot of downside risk in this type of re-engagement. To me, it looked carefully scripted, perhaps carefully scripted to give her an opportunity to shine. And that's great. Like, I think that that's good for the country as well. And I think it's actually will be pretty tricky for opponents to go after it because there's just so much good sense in having a pathway to engage other than retaliatory, reprisals against each other, which is all we've had for the last 6 years.
But Kory, there are always people who say, why the hell are you meeting with those butchers, right? Those people that do these terrible things, right? And we shouldn't be meeting with them. We should be sanctioning them and lecturing them. She has made it a tenet of her time in that job that she believes in dialogue, that she believes in talking to people that are your opponents. How do you think this is going to go over?
I think it'll largely be passed without having any consequence one way or the other. Like I just don't think that this is getting a ton of attention from folks. And I would say, including the Chinese, like I just think it's difficult for people to take Canada seriously when it comes to foreign affairs issues. We basically no longer have a military that's functional in any way. We have pulled back from our obligations around alliances. We've chosen to hector from the sidelines without backing things up, either with aid or sanctions or you name it. Like it's empty rhetoric time and time again, and I think it's empty rhetoric around this. Like, I would think there's more votes in being tough with China than there is in engagement. If you just want to look at the raw politics of it, right. And I think there's more influence in terms of international diplomacy, and increasing our military presence in the Pacific and working more closely with allies like Australia and Japan and South Korea and the United States. And so I think, we're doing the one least impactful, least serious thing, which is talking to China.
Scott, what do you think about this Jolie angle? Do you think she's burnishing? I mean, I think she's burnishing her resume for leadership.
I think so. I think she's rounding out her skill set, rounding out her ability to present a skill set that feels serious. If the knock on her was that she's politically appealing and organizationally impressive, but sometimes substantively shaky, this is her effort. I think all throughout foreign affairs, to be honest with you, she's been managing with some care. I don't always like everything she's done on the Israeli file, but I think there's been a deliberateness to it. I don't think things have happened by mistake. But look, I think the most interesting aspect of this file is what it means for the Conservatives, in all honesty, because I think this is a file where indisputably the short-term, immediate, gratifying politics are on the other side of the ledger than engagement. But the reality is that Canada has to have some kind of relationship with China. And so if you are the Conservatives, you have this situation, you're Poilievre and Poilievre's camp. You look at this and you go, so do we just jump on this with both boots and kick the living piss out of them because that's in keeping with the narrative that we've been holding? Or at one point do we start to think about, well, let's do this with no pads. Like let's just mail this one in because we're going to inherit this relationship if we win, and we're going to have to figure out what to do with it. And the stuff we say on YouTube isn't actually going to carry us through government. And then you get people say, no, if we start to think like that, then we start to think like a government in waiting. Then you start to make mistakes. Then you lose your political fucking edge and blade. And so I think it's going to be interesting to watch this. I think that as a matter of ministerial effort, Jolie actually exhibit a little bit of courage here. And I do agree with Jordan. It's been very carefully, precisely scripted and managed, but electorally, it's a vulnerability.
All right. Let's move to our last topic, Council of the Federation. This is, for those of you who don't follow closely, the premiers. and heads of territorial governments.
Oh, I thought
Sounds like something from Star Trek, though, doesn't
I
it?
was like Council of the Federation. I thought it was an alt rock band from Alabama. I thought the Council of the Federation.
No.
I like their tune, Gray Horses.
These are the people that tell Kirk he cannot attack the Klingons.
That's right. Prime directive and all right. Yes.
Right. Back away from the neutral zone. They've got my shit.
My God. All right. They were all there. They were angry about federal government encroachment in their jurisdictions. They had some tough talk for Justin Trudeau for spending in their areas of jurisdiction. They also, however, had some thoughts on what the federal government should spend money on in its own areas of jurisdiction, which was interesting. Trudeau blew them off in a statement just before leaving for vacation, told them to talk to Dominic LeBlanc if they had any questions. Scott, when you were in the PMO, how did you handle premiers' meetings? I don't think they had the highfalutin title back then.
They didn't have the highfalutin title back then, but in that zone, it was it was in and around that area that that Charest really started to form the Council of Federation. And if you remember, it began, and Kory may remember, it began with a head of steam and really put a lot of pressure on the federal government. Harper had to basically make a concession with some transfers. Then Charest turned around and used them to cut taxes and try to run for re-election, which I think made Harper's head fucking burst. And so, like, my honest review is this is probably one of the most inconsequential meetings of premiers in a long, long time. It really felt like it was according to Hoyle. We'll complain about this. There'll be some internal incoherence because, we're going to say stay out of our sandbox, but we're going to go over and put a Tonka toy in the middle of yours and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think it mattered. I think they have a point with respect to equalization. It's been 20 years. It's since we were there, but I'll offer some free advice to the Conservatives federally for whatever benefit you might think of just sort of trying to join the anti-Trudeau chorus. Don't get on the equalization train. That thing is that is a nightmare. And unless you were in the position that we were in then, which was our coffers were full and it looked like they were going to get fuller, and we had the ability to negotiate from a position of wealth. And so we knew they'd ask for a mint, and we could offer them a mint and even a little more. And we did it in parallel to health accord discussions so that you played those things off of one another and they reinforced. Like, just don't get into this discussion because it is the premiers all have a different point of view actually on it, even though they mask it by saying that they're unified in terms of bitching about it. But it is a complete marsh. And if you drive your truck in there, you will not be able to get it out.
Jordan, we've given Wab Kinew a lot of love on this podcast. So let's give Wab Kinew some accountability. He's the guy that demands that Trudeau, he leads the fight on Trudeau has to reach 2% of defense spending. For trade purposes, he's worried about NAFTA or CUSMA, whatever the hell it is. If we don't meet our 2%. But then similarly, he says, we'll take more immigrants, but we need more money from the federal government. They're the people that have the money. NDP calling for 2% on defense spending? I mean, that's going to have ramifications on spending elsewhere in our country, for sure.
Yeah, but Wab Kinew's not in charge of it, so I don't think it has any ramifications on anything. Let's be really clear. The options federally, if you care about 2%, are the Liberals who are promising 2% in 2032. So no 2% anytime soon. Certainly no 2% under a potential Trump presidency. The Conservatives, who are not promising a timeline around 2%, so probably not 2% there. The NDP, who views that you could put that money elsewhere, so not 2% there. So there's actually nobody federally right now who's really making a hard, substantive commitment to 2% within an immediate time frame. And of course, there's really good reasons for that you can listen to smart defense people explain to you rather than us. But I think Kinew's push on this was interesting, right? He was able to capture a little slice of the headlines there. It was a little unusual. He definitely stood out in the Council of Federation. And I think that if you're looking to burnish your very, very high popularity in your own province, going out and finding an angle that allows you to talk about Manitoba's trade and defending that, by the way, has nothing to do with what you or your government needs to do, it's not the worst play in the book, right? So he's out there, and I think he's also expressing an anxiety that other premiers and certainly others in Canada have articulated. Like, we don't know what will placate the next Trump presidency, but certainly NATO spending has been a clear irritant there. And so raising it in that context makes some sense to me. I don't really think it has much ramifications beyond that. I thought it was creative. And I appreciated the chutzpah also of the premiers going out and making that argument in something that's completely not their domain, while complaining that the feds were, pissing in their pond. So I think all of it was just for that immediate news cycle.
Kory, Doug Ford is the new chair of the Council of the Federation, and he sounded like he was going to be the federal government's worst enemy, which is not really the role he's played so far.
I think there's a lot of frustration. I think some of it's from Premier Ford, but I think it's shared by a lot of others around that table that the body as it exists right now is not being terribly effective. And I think in part they overreach, and the idea that there's going to be a new health deal or something that delivers tens of billions of dollars to provinces in the near term, I don't think is realistic. I think there's like a lot of things that the premiers have typically asked for that are not terribly realistic. But I do think there are some areas where they can get some gains. And I think what the Council of Federation should be focused on is more achievable goals, things that are perhaps a little bit more transactional and that are in closer alignment with what voters in their provinces that they represent are looking for. I think there's some obvious ones right now where the provinces should be pressuring the federal government on areas of their jurisdiction. One, criminal justice reform. Like we've talked about many times on this podcast about the auto theft plague that is taking vehicles out of Scott's driveway at an alarming rate, along with many other people's. And the zombie apocalypse that is spreading across the downtown of every community, and like there's a lot of stuff that has to happen there, and you can't do it without some substantial change on the federal side. There was a big roundup about 6 weeks ago of folks in auto theft rings, and a huge percentage of them were on bail. So it's like, this is clearly not working. Like, you're never going to get ahead if you're playing catch and release. So I think there's that stuff. I think there's a bunch of things that are going to be very important as this will be a transition year. I think in terms of who will be in charge of the federal government, around what climate policy is going to look like and what energy policy is going to look like. We're moving towards electrification at an alarming rate, and you're seeing that kind of happening, across the board. And we have probably $1 trillion just in Ontario of investment that needs to be made in generation and transmission. And there's no way that any province is going to be able to do that without substantial participation by the federal government, both from a regulatory and approval perspective, and also from a funding perspective. So, there are a lot of big questions there. And the other one is health policy. While healthcare is primarily a provincial jurisdiction, things like, drug approvals are a federal responsibility. There are all kinds of things where you could see deals that are possible that are less about the grand bargain around equalization or health accords. And I tend to agree with Scott on all of that. I think that that is unlikely to occur, and probably not where the obvious wins are. But it has to be more than just a talk shop, which is what it is right now.
Yeah, so you're kind of talking about lowering the temperature and making it a bit more functional in terms of what it accomplishes.
Well, pressuring and lobbying, but on things that are more transactional. So I don't think it has to be, in all cases, cooperative. I think sometimes you got to jam other levels of government a little bit in order to get results. But what is it that you're reaching for? And if the test is, send us tens of billions of dollars more for healthcare funding or nothing, then you're going to get nothing more times than not.
So, Is it a factor at all that all of these conservative premiers are more likely to lose their governments once Poilievre becomes prime minister? They're all on the clock once Poilievre becomes prime minister. Are they conscious of that? Are they thinking about that? Is that a factor? Anybody?
For me, well, I think it's the challenge is incumbency right now. I don't think it's a conservative or liberal thing. I think there's a lot of commentary around the UK election, for instance, about how somehow this is Europe is tacking towards the center and it's a progressive renaissance, et cetera, et cetera. Much more easy explanation is longtime incumbents are getting smoked. And largely over cost of living measures, and in areas where they have conservative governments, it's moving towards progressive governments, and where you have progressive governments, it's moving towards conservative governments. So
yeah, if it was as simple as that,
anti-incumbency is, I think, the driving factor right now.
That does not explain why Ford thinks he needs to have an election before there's a federal election. That does not explain why there's a rumor going around that Tim Houston's going to call a snap election. I think some conservative premiers in certain jurisdictions look at the factor you've mentioned, David, and they say, and let's combine it with Kory's to be generous. It's tough enough to be an incumbent right now, but then if the political wave shifts and people don't like what they get out of the federal conservatives a year after they've been in office, that could be bad for us. So they're thinking maybe we get out while we can still beat up on the guy who's at 22%. I think the folks out west, I don't think they give a fuck. I think they think they're bulletproof and they don't care, and it doesn't affect their thinking.
Yeah.
I think some of those conservative premiers don't like the trajectory and they want to lock in before things get worse too.
Well, there's another way you could look at it, and that's that a very angry electorate is very focused on the federal government in terms of who's to blame for inflation and the state of the economy more generally, and that's Trudeau. And as long as he's there, that's where the voters' eye is sore on is focused. The second that Trudeau's gone,
people start worrying. People start wondering about their healthcare system and who's in charge of that.
Looking for a new target, and so I think there's a benefit of going while Trudeau's around for sure. All
right, hey, Hughes, Gordon Pinsent, we got to round this thing out.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Thank you, sir. Scott,
my Hey You goes to the PMO. It's been 28 days since Toronto St. Paul's by-election loss, and fuck nothing has happened except...
You sound like the woman at the start of Titanic.
Exactly. Except for a little bit of chaos, to be honest, a little bit of not great work. So just looking at kind of the behind-the-scene arts and how they're being applied, I mean, let's set aside the fact that you got Seamus leaving and there's lots of other caucus members talking about leaving and stuff. Yeah, you quelled if you needed to bother to quell. I'm not sure how much actually ended up getting stage managed. Maybe you quelled a chorus of voices coming out after that by-election saying, look, it's time for the PM to go. But you get this strange story by Fife about PMO ascribing views to Katie, saying that she thinks that Freeland's no goddamn good at her job, certainly no good in terms of being an ambassador on the economic program to Canadians and to voters. Then you get a bumbling 3 days of half-assed denials and no changes. Then Seamus is going out, and what's the response to that? Suddenly a story in the front page appears saying that Carney was invited in the cabinet. The prime minister met with him just a few days again prior, so that's subsequent to the by-election, and he was offered. But what was he offered? It's not clear. He obviously wasn't offered. He wasn't offered Freeland's post. So, what's the point of that story? What are you trying to manage for 48 hours, there was speculation that something.
They're not recruiting Carney; they're blading him.
Right. They're just trying to shift the blame for Carney not being in cabinet onto Carney. Yeah. But if you look at it, you also have a circumstance which is like it betrays the reality of our situation. The reality is the prime minister hasn't said he's going to step down. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that's one big response of saying, do I get the need for change? Yes. And here's an answer to it. That's off the table. Says not going to go. Okay. Do you see a substantial change in cabinet or orientation with respect to economic program? No. Carney can come in if he wants, but he can't be the minister of finance. We think we need him in fisheries. Fucking give me a break. And then what else do you get in terms of a substantive response on policy overall? Any hints that maybe the government's going to revisit, or much less any indication, any announcement, any commitment to revisiting the consumer carbon tax? No, they're not willing to reverse that. It's too signature to their identity. So again, what you end up with, right, whether it's senior cabinet, whether it's people around the prime minister, whether it's the prime minister himself, or whether it's core elements of the policy and the economic agenda, none of that is something that they're willing to make change on. Now the prime minister goes on vacation. He's entitled to a fucking vacation. I get that. But it's 28 days and counting, and there's been no reaction whatsoever other than half-assery in the newspapers and the salons of Ottawa about what your response is to the earthquake. And it was a fucking earthquake. And it means that you're at 24 and you're staying at 24. There's no response. There's no indication of change. There's just an obvious cataloging of the prime minister and the PMO's indifference and discomfort with anything that might actually constitute substantive and real change. So I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what's going on, but these too cute by half sort of leaks about Mark Carney and Freeland and all this, it's no good. This is not good work.
You know, as Nick Kuvalis predicted to me months and months and months ago on the podcast, the Conservatives are headed to 50 points in Ontario. Can you fucking imagine that? Conservatives at 50 points in Ontario? Federally? It's unbelievable.
It's an unnatural number. And so for it to occur, it is not just enough to imagine that they're good. You have to be bad.
Stop and for the reaction to be to change nothing is stunning.
Yeah, fuck you.
I agree.
Yeah. All right, Jordan, you're up.
So my hey you is to the Liberal Party of Canada. You guys probably saw the little access to information that CBC got late last week about what Elections Canada is floating in terms of rule changes for nomination races. So this is part of, because the chief electoral, remember, we're still having an inquiry, so that's interesting on foreign interference. So the chief electoral officer is going to be making some recommendations there about what should happen with nomination races. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Some of it's good, some of it's not good. But guess what? It's all going to go in there and it's all going to become more plausible because you guys won't make the move to limit voting to citizens and permanent residents. So they are going to be responsible for changing the rules in the nomination in a completely unsustainable way for all parties simply because they can't get their shit together to make the one obvious, both politically necessary and, by the way, just like fucking correct change on the basis of the integrity of our electoral system. So that's my hey you. Smarten up and fly right before somebody else does it for you.
Excellent. All right. Good one. Kory?
Well, we already touched on this a little bit, but my hey you is to Seamus O'Regan. It's, I think, a real loss for the government to have him leaving cabinet, and I think it's also worth pointing out that very few people make the transition from like a media anchor, mainstream media news personality to politics. It's so someone once described it to me. It's kind of like it's all horse racing, but it's when the jockey tries to become the horse, it doesn't always work out well. But in this case,
because they're so little.
Yeah, they're so small. But I think Seamus is one of the few people I've seen who actually made that transition, and he's also doing something else that doesn't happen very often, which is leaving politics on its own terms. And so we give people a lot of shit on this podcast, so I think it's good to recognize when somebody has done well. So hey, Seamus, you left a positive mark in politics, and wish you all the best in whatever comes next.
Hear, hear.
Here. I'll just pick up from that. I got a two-parter. One is to Seamus, whom I don't know. We're not friends. We don't hang out. I'm not part of that beautiful set from Toronto that used to be part of it. But I have admired him in this job. And I was a skeptic for the reasons you identified when he joined. I thought he was a crony who wasn't going to be very good, and he was outstanding. He was an outstanding minister. He was an outstanding communicator. They should have used him more. His appearance on the Herle Burley is one of the high points of that show. So, hey, you, Seamus O'Regan, you had a great run. And you made a big difference for the party and the government. My other hey, you goes out to my great friend, Steve McKinnon, who now has that job of labor and is a full-time member of the cabinet. Steve and I have known each other decades, part of the wars, guy from New Brunswick originally, and as true an exemplar of the centrist traditional Liberal Party as you can find. So I'm delighted to see him now getting more clout in the government. So, hey you, Seamus, great job. Hey you, Steve, congratulations. I would like to thank you three for being here today. This was fun conversation, as always. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you accursed out there. God bless you for your loyalty to this travesty that occurs every Monday. We'll see you next week with more of it. Take care.